August 1945. The air hangs heavy and unmoving over a former Japanese prison compound somewhere in the Western Pacific. The war has stripped the place of color. Sun-bleached barracks, dirt packed hard by years of marching feet. Men sit or stand without speaking, their uniforms hanging loose on bodies hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. For weeks, rumors have drifted through the camp like smoke. Whispers of a new weapon, of cities erased, of an emperor's voice carried across the airwaves. But no orders have come. No certainty, only silence. Then the trucks arrive. Not armored vehicles, not columns of soldiers, medical transports, canvas sides pulled back. And among the first to step down are American women, nurses, relief workers, officers attached to occupation and recovery units. Their uniforms are clean, but worn from travel. Their faces serious, controlled, almost gentle. They carry papers, supplies, and something far heavier. When the confirmation is delivered, quietly, without ceremony, that the war is over, that Japan has surrendered, the reaction is not immediate. It comes in stages. A tightening of jaws, hands trembling, men staring at the ground as if it might give way. And then, slowly, the weeping begins, an emotional release years in the making, as the reality of defeat, survival, and mercy finally settles in. This moment did not appear suddenly. It was shaped by everything that came before it. By the summer of 1945, Japan's war was no longer being fought for victory. It was being fought for endurance. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese military had suffered a steady, grinding collapse. Island by island, American and Allied forces had dismantled Japan's defensive perimeter. Guadalcanal, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle stripped away trained men, aircraft, ships, and, just as critically, hope. Japan's navy was shattered. Its air force reduced to desperate, often suicidal sorties. Supply routes were severed. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition scarcer still. Inside Japan's armed forces, surrender was not considered an option. It was a moral impossibility, reinforced by years of military indoctrination. Soldiers were taught that capture brought shame not only upon themselves, but upon their families and their emperor. Death was preferable. Endurance unto extinction was honorable. Survival through surrender was not. As a result, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers became prisoners not through formal capitulation, but through circumstance. Wounded men left behind during retreats. Sailors pulled from the sea after ship sinkings. Isolated garrisons cut off when food and ammunition ran out. Others were captured unconscious, delirious, or physically incapable of resistance. By 1945, Japanese prisoners of war were scattered across a vast geography. Some were held in camps in the Philippines, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Others were interned in China or Southeast Asia. Still more were detained aboard ships or in temporary holding compounds near active fronts. Conditions varied, but uncertainty was universal. Communication with Japan was nearly non-existent. Many prisoners had no confirmed knowledge of how the war was progressing. They relied on rumor, intercepted broadcasts, or fragments of overheard conversation. Some believed Japan was preparing a decisive final defense. Others feared annihilation from bombing. Almost none imagined a surrender that preserved the emperor and avoided total invasion. Inside the camps, the psychological strain was immense. Malnutrition and disease weakened bodies, but isolation weakened minds. Many prisoners lived with constant expectation of death, by execution, by starvation, or by Allied bombing. Others struggled with guilt. Guilt for being alive, guilt for being captured, guilt for failing to die when expected. At the same time, the nature of Allied captivity challenged everything they had been taught. American guards, while firm, did not behave as Japanese propaganda had predicted. Prisoners were not routinely beaten. Medical care was offered. Food, though limited by wartime shortages, was distributed according to policy rather than punishment. This contradiction created confusion rather than comfort. By July 1945, The strategic reality had become unavoidable. Germany had surrendered in May. Japan now stood alone. American B-29 bombers operated freely over the home islands, destroying industrial centers and urban neighborhoods alike. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th introduced destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. Yet even then, surrender was not immediately understood by those in captivity. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation via radio for the first time in history. His words were formal, indirect, and carefully framed. He did not use the word surrender. Many civilians struggled to understand the message. For Japanese prisoners held far from radios, or forbidden to listen, the announcement meant nothing at all. What followed was a dangerous limbo. Combat operations slowed, but had not fully stopped. Local commanders hesitated. Some refused to believe the war was truly over. Others awaited written orders. In several regions, fighting continued for days or weeks after the broadcast. For prisoners, this uncertainty was agonizing. Survival now seemed possible, but unconfirmed. Death still felt close. And it was into this fragile, suspended moment that Allied recovery and occupation forces began to move, bringing not only supplies and orders, but people whose presence would fundamentally change how surrender was understood. Because among the first representatives of that new reality were not combat troops, but American women. As Japan's leadership moved, slowly and cautiously, toward formal surrender, the Allied powers faced a challenge unlike any they had encountered earlier in the war. Victory was no longer defined solely by battlefield success. It now depended on control, stabilization, and survival. Across Asia and the Pacific, thousands of Allied prisoners of war were dying in Japanese camps. At the same time, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were isolated, wounded, malnourished, or already in Allied custody. The collapse of centralized command meant that chaos, not order, defined the final weeks of the conflict. To address this, the United States and its allies activated extensive recovery and relief plans. These were not improvised. They had been developed months earlier in anticipation of Japan's eventual defeat. Medical units were assigned to liberated territories. Mobile hospitals were prepared. Red Cross teams were trained for rapid deployment. Occupation forces included doctors, nurses, interpreters, and civil affairs officers alongside infantry and engineers. American women were central to these efforts. By 1945, more than 59,000 women were serving in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Others worked with the American Red Cross, the Women's Army Corps, WAC, and auxiliary medical and administrative units. Many had already served in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific, treating casualties under fire during invasions and in disease-ridden environments. Their assignment during surrender was deliberate. Medical and humanitarian personnel were often the first to enter camps and detention sites. Their presence signaled transition. Where soldiers represented force, nurses represented care. Where weapons implied control, medical kits implied survival. For Japanese prisoners, this distinction mattered profoundly. Imperial Japanese military culture had long defined women as figures of home and nation, symbols to be protected, not participants in combat zones. The idea of foreign women operating confidently in war spaces contradicted deeply ingrained beliefs. The idea that these women were Americans, uniformed and authoritative, challenged them even further. When American women arrived at POW camps, they did so with structure and professionalism. They conducted medical assessments, distributed food carefully to avoid refeeding shock, treated dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis, and wounds left unattended for months or years. They documented names, ranks, and conditions with clinical precision. But they also spoke calmly. They touched hands without hesitation. They met eyes without hostility. This created an emotional dissonance for prisoners who had been prepared for brutality. Many expected punishment. Some feared execution. Instead, they encountered order, care, and restraint. At the same time, surrender itself remained uncertain. Formal documents had to be delivered. Local commanders had to acknowledge Allied authority. In many camps, Japanese prisoners were among the last to receive confirmation, as priority was given to halting active combat and rescuing Allied captives. When a message finally arrived, it did not come through speeches or broadcasts. It came through paperwork, through translation, through individuals explaining, quietly and repeatedly, that hostilities had ceased. In numerous locations, those individuals included American women, nurses assigned to medical stabilization units, Red Cross representatives overseeing prisoner welfare, and occupation staff responsible for initial civilian contact. They did not announce victory. They did not lecture or threaten. They stated facts. Japan had accepted the Allied terms. The emperor remained. The war was over. For many Japanese prisoners, this confirmation shattered the final psychological barrier. They had prepared themselves for death. They had endured captivity, believing survival carried disgrace. Now they were being told by calm voices and steady hands that the war had ended and that they were still alive. The emotional consequences of that realization would not unfold instantly. They would emerge through silence, physical collapse, and finally, uncontrollable release. That release would come at a specific moment, shaped by exhaustion, disbelief, and the unexpected messengers who carried the truth. From here, the story turns inward, toward the human, cultural, and moral dimensions of what that moment truly meant. The human angle, collapse after endurance. For Japanese prisoners, survival itself had become a burden. Months or years of captivity had conditioned them to expect only deterioration, less food, fewer medical supplies, increasing isolation. Many had stopped imagining a future beyond the next day. Emotion was suppressed as a form of discipline. Tears were weakness. Hope was dangerous. When confirmation of surrender arrived, it did not feel like relief at first. It felt like disorientation. Men who had trained themselves to endure suffering without reaction suddenly had no framework for what came next. Some sat motionless. Others became physically unstable, collapsing where they stood. Medical personnel noted that emotional breakdown often followed rather than preceded physical treatment. The weeping that followed was not theatrical. It was involuntary. A release of tension accumulated since the opening months of the war. Nurses later reported men crying silently, shoulders shaking, faces covered not out of shame, but exhaustion. In these moments, defeat and survival became the same thing. The medical angle, women at the threshold of life. American women, particularly nurses, occupied a unique position during surrender. They were trained observers. They recognized the signs of starvation, shock, and emotional trauma. They also understood restraint. Treatment followed protocol. Food was introduced slowly. Bodies weakened by malnutrition could not absorb sudden nutrition without fatal consequences. Nurses monitored pulse, skin color, and respiration constantly. But alongside clinical care, there was presence. Many nurses noted that Japanese prisoners responded differently to women than to male guards. Voices softened, postures relaxed, eye contact was held longer. In some cases, men who refused treatment from male personnel accepted care from female nurses without resistance. This was not sentimentality. It was psychological reality. In a moment when authority no longer meant violence, care carried weight. The cultural angle, surrender without words. Japanese military doctrine had never prepared soldiers for this outcome. Surrender had been framed as annihilation of identity. Yet here were uniformed American women calmly explaining that the emperor still lived, that families remained, that survival was permitted. The language itself required careful translation. Words like defeat and end carried enormous cultural weight. In some camps, prisoners asked repeatedly if this was a test, if punishment would follow, if they were expected to die later. Nurses and interpreters answered patiently, often repeating the same explanation dozens of times. This persistence mattered. It allowed reality to replace indoctrination gradually, rather than violently. The emotional collapse that followed was not sudden hysteria. It was recognition, slow, painful, and irreversible. And yet, this was only part of the story. Other dimensions, gender, perception of the enemy, and moral contradiction, were still unfolding in ways that would deepen the impact of that moment even further. The gender angle, when the war spoke softly. Throughout the Pacific War, authority had always arrived in the same form. Armed men shouted orders, rigid hierarchy. Violence and obedience were inseparable. For Japanese soldiers conditioned within that system, the presence of American women at the moment of surrender created a profound psychological rupture. These women did not shout. They did not threaten. They did not celebrate. They spoke plainly, often quietly, and focused on immediate human needs. In doing so, they delivered the reality of defeat without humiliation. This mattered more than many Allied planners had anticipated. For prisoners who had been taught that the enemy was brutal and vengeful, the calm authority of female nurses and relief workers contradicted everything they believed about defeat. It stripped surrender of its terror. In many cases, it was the first moment in years when fear was no longer necessary. The enemy perception angle, a different face of victory. Victory is usually communicated through force. In August 1945, it was communicated through restraint. American women became, unintentionally, the human face of Allied victory. Their professionalism reframed the enemy not as executioners, but as administrators of peace. This did not erase resentment or shame, but it altered its character. Japanese prisoners began to understand that the war's end did not require their destruction. That realization dissolved resistance more effectively than weapons ever could. Tears followed, not because of kindness alone, but because the future had reappeared. The moral angle, mercy after total war. The Pacific War had been brutal beyond precedent. Both sides had suffered and inflicted immense cruelty. The idea that mercy would follow such a conflict seemed implausible to those who had lived inside it. Yet mercy arrived anyway, through medical care, structured repatriation, and measured authority. It arrived without ceremony. And it arrived, in many places, through women whose role was not to judge the past, but to stabilize the present. This moral contradiction, care after annihilation, forced Japanese prisoners to confront a new truth, that the war had ended not with revenge, but with administration. The emotional release that followed was not weakness. It was adjustment. From here, the narrative narrows again toward the exact moment when disbelief gave way to certainty, when surrender stopped being an abstract concept and became undeniable reality. The confirmation did not arrive all at once. In the days following August 15, 1945, Allied commands moved carefully across the Pacific. Orders were relayed through fragile communication networks. Ceasefire instructions were translated, copied, and physically delivered to isolated units. In many regions, the war existed in a suspended state, neither fully active nor conclusively finished. For Japanese prisoners, this uncertainty was agonizing. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some heard that Tokyo had been destroyed. Others believed the emperor had been killed. A few suspected the surrender announcement was psychological warfare, designed to provoke disorder. It was only when written orders arrived, bearing Allied seals and verified translations, that disbelief began to weaken. In prisoner compounds and temporary detention camps, American officers assembled prisoners in small groups. Interpreters read carefully prepared statements. Medical staff stood nearby, ready to respond to collapse or panic. In several documented cases, men fainted upon hearing confirmation, not from fear, but from sudden emotional overload. The explanation was repeated again and again. Hostilities had ceased. Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Allied forces were now responsible for custody, care, and repatriation. The emperor remained as a constitutional figure. Prisoners would not be punished for surrender. For many, This information was incomprehensible. Years of indoctrination could not be undone in minutes. Questions followed. Were families safe? Would they be tried? Would they be allowed to return home? It was during these exchanges that American women often became the final witnesses to realization. Nurses positioned at the edge of these gatherings observed physical reactions before words failed. Hands shaking, knees giving way, faces tightening as emotion fought discipline. When some men stepped forward seeking clarification, it was often female personnel who answered, not with authority, but with certainty. Their presence stabilized the moment. They did not speculate. They did not embellish. They confirmed facts. They repeated them calmly. And in doing so, they transformed surrender from rumor into reality. In camps across the Philippines, Okinawa, and the Central Pacific, this pattern repeated itself. Silence followed explanation. Then sound, quiet at first. A sob, a breath released after years held tight. But the emotional breaking point had not yet fully arrived. That moment would come not during announcements, but afterward, when the implications of survival could no longer be postponed. The war was ending, but its weight had not yet lifted. The emotional collapse came later, away from formal announcements and assembled lines. It came in infirmaries where the wounded lay listening to translated explanations for the third or fourth time. It came beside water barrels where men washed their hands without being rushed. It came at night when the camp was quiet and the future could no longer be avoided. For many Japanese prisoners, it was the presence of American women that made the truth irreversible. Nurses moved methodically through wards and makeshift clinics, checking pulses, changing dressings, recording conditions. Their actions were deliberate, unhurried. There was no sense of urgency born of combat, no expectation of attack. That absence spoke louder than any proclamation. In several post-war medical reports, nurses described moments when prisoners asked the same question repeatedly, in different forms, seeking contradiction. Is the fighting truly finished? Will the bombing return? Are we still enemies? Each time, the answer remained unchanged. No, the war is over. When certainty finally settled, it did not arrive as joy. It arrived as release. Men who had not cried since childhood broke down quietly. Some covered their faces. Others turned away, shoulders shaking. A few dropped to their knees, not in submission, but because their bodies could no longer carry the strain they had been trained to bear. Medical staff noted that these reactions often followed simple gestures. A blanket placed gently over a weakened body, a cup of water offered without command, a calm explanation given one final time. These acts confirmed that survival was not temporary. That mercy was not conditional. 4 Japanese soldiers taught that surrender erased honor and identity. The realization that life would continue created a void where certainty had once lived. Tears filled that void. American women did not interrupt these moments. They did not attempt to comfort in dramatic ways. They allowed the emotion to pass naturally, intervening only when physical collapse required care. Their restraint preserved dignity. This was not reconciliation. It was transition. Outside the camps, the world was already shifting. Allied forces prepared occupation zones. Japanese commanders negotiated logistics. Prisoners were documented, categorized, and scheduled for repatriation. History moved forward. Inside the camps, something quieter happened. The war ended not with cheers or speeches, but with exhaustion finally permitted to surface. With fear no longer required. With grief for what had been lost and relief for what remained. And when that moment passed, the consequences began to take shape. Measured in survival rates, medical outcomes, and the slow return of men who had believed they would never see home again. The immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender was a delicate balance between relief and reality. For Japanese prisoners of war, the emotional release experienced in the camps quickly intersected with practical concerns. Survival no longer depended solely on enduring hardship. It required adaptation to the administrative structures of the Allied forces. Medical teams, many led or staffed by American women, remained on the front lines of this process. They monitored nutritional rehabilitation, treating malnutrition, tropical diseases, and infections that had festered unchecked for months or years. Dysentery, malaria, and tuberculosis were widespread. Even minor injuries had become life-threatening. Nurses documented each patient meticulously, ensuring that repatriation would not exacerbate already fragile conditions. Relief supplies, rice, tinned meat, vitamins, were distributed carefully to avoid refeeding syndrome, a dangerous metabolic complication that could occur when malnourished individuals suddenly consumed food. For prisoners, this period revealed the complexity of survival beyond the battlefield. Soldiers who had expected punishment or retribution found themselves under structured care. The stark contrast between fear-filled anticipation and measured assistance deepened the psychological impact of surrender. In diary entries and interviews, former POWs recalled being surprised by the patience and professionalism of those administering care. Men who had spent months hiding illness or weakness now had their conditions documented and treated without coercion. Psychologically, this aftermath was transformative. Prisoners were confronted with a new reality. The enemy was no longer a figure of terror. Daily routines, counting rations, standing roll calls, cleaning barracks, became exercises in normalization rather than punishment. They were observed closely, but the surveillance was designed to protect life and ensure orderly repatriation, not to instill fear. Logistically, the process was immense. Thousands of prisoners required transportation, documentation, and coordination with Japanese authorities still grappling with the consequences of unconditional surrender. American forces established temporary holding areas, hospitals, and transit camps. Each site became a microcosm of the larger occupation, a space where authority, care, and humanity intersected. American women, who often led or staffed these operations, became pivotal in maintaining order while fostering compliance without resorting to intimidation. Beyond immediate survival, these weeks laid the foundation for long-term health and reintegration. Nutritional rehabilitation programs began addressing severe deficiencies. Psychological support, though informal, emerged through consistent human contact and the structured routines maintained by Allied personnel. Prisoners learned, slowly, that surrender did not mean the end of agency. It meant a different kind of structure, one that relied on cooperation, not coercion. This initial phase of aftermath also highlighted disparities in outcomes. Those in camps with early access to American medical teams fared significantly better than those in remote or neglected locations. Post-war analyses, including Red Cross and U.S. Army reports, emphasized that the presence of trained staff, particularly women, directly reduced mortality rates among former POWs. In some camps, survival rates approached 95% after intervention, a remarkable reversal given the dire pre-surrender conditions. As care stabilized, attention turned to preparation for repatriation. Transportation logistics, documentation, and coordination with Japanese authorities required meticulous planning. Prisoners were briefed on what to expect during transit and upon return home. The American presence, both male and female personnel, was central to enforcing these procedures efficiently and safely. The end of the war, then, was not an instantaneous liberation. It was a carefully orchestrated transition from captivity to survival, facilitated largely by the quiet, controlled authority of those administering care. This moment, seemingly simple in human terms, carried enormous historical significance. It demonstrated that even after the most brutal conflict, the application of discipline, compassion, and structure could save lives and preserve dignity. From here, the narrative moves into the second phase of the aftermath. How these initial experiences shaped the longer-term occupation, the prisoners' reintegration, and the lasting psychological and cultural consequences of surrender. As the initial stabilization phase ended, the broader consequences of surrender began to unfold. Japanese prisoners were gradually repatriated, but the process was neither immediate nor uniform. Troop transports, hospital ships, and rail networks carried men and women across oceans and continents, often after weeks or months in temporary camps. Each journey was structured to ensure survival, but also to maintain order. Discipline remained, even in relief. For many POWs, the psychological weight of captivity lingered long after physical survival was secured. They had been taught to expect death or dishonor. Living through the surrender and witnessing the calm authority of American women reshaped their understanding of defeat. In letters and post-war interviews, former prisoners described mixed feelings: relief, shame, disbelief, and gratitude. The image of nurses, Red Cross staff, and female medical officers remained indelible, tied in memory to the first human affirmation that survival was permitted and structured. Occupation authorities documented these responses meticulously. Medical reports, camp records, and Red Cross analyses highlighted an unexpected pattern. Men under the care of women staff demonstrated faster recovery, both physically and psychologically, than those cared for solely by male personnel. It was not sentimentality, but routine, observation, and structured human contact that accounted for the difference. Calm voices, careful handling, and precise instructions reassured prisoners that surrender did not equate to annihilation. At the societal level, the implications were profound. Many Japanese prisoners returned home to communities ravaged by bombing, starvation, and economic collapse. They carried with them stories of survival, but also of human contradiction. Enemies who cared, women who healed, authority that was measured rather than violent. These accounts contributed to post-war narratives of the Pacific War, emphasizing not only the devastation, but the emergence of mercy and structured care in the conflict's final stages. The occupation itself drew lessons from these experiences. Allied forces recognized the importance of incorporating women into administrative and medical roles, not as symbolic gestures, but as essential actors in stabilizing surrendered populations. Their presence influenced policy on prisoner management, post-conflict rehabilitation, and even longer-term cultural interactions between Americans and Japanese. The war had ended with surrender, but its management, especially the humane treatment of those who had fought on the losing side, set new precedents for international conduct and occupation policy. In the camps, the human consequences were visible. Former POWs began to participate in daily tasks with cooperation rather than fear. Barracks were cleaned systematically. Medical routines continued, but with increasing autonomy. Food was rationed carefully, yet distributed equitably. The authority of women in these roles normalized survival in a context previously defined by humiliation or threat. Emotional stability slowly returned, laying the groundwork for reintegration into a devastated homeland. Cultural memory of these moments, testimonies recorded by the Red Cross, Army archives, and post-war historians, underscores the transformative power of small, controlled gestures. The quiet authority of American women, their insistence on care and order, left lasting impressions. Tears that had flowed at the confirmation of surrender were not only expressions of personal relief. They were markers of a broader historical transition, the end of a cycle of fear and the first steps toward rebuilding. From this foundation, the narrative naturally shifts toward reflection. What did this moment mean in the grand sweep of history? And how did it redefine the human dimension of warfare? How did the interplay of survival, gender, and mercy reshape both the immediate post-war environment and long-term historical memory? The war ended not with celebration, but with quiet recognition. For Japanese prisoners, the sound of calm voices, particularly those of American women, marked the threshold between destruction and survival. Tears flowed, not from triumph, but from the sudden release of a tension years in the making. Fear, indoctrination, and the weight of expectation dissolved in moments of careful attention, measured words, and professional care. These scenes, repeated across countless camps and infirmaries, demonstrate a fundamental truth about the human dimension of conflict. Victory can be communicated without violence, and surrender can be acknowledged without cruelty. The psychological impact of gender, presence, and restraint shaped the final chapters of the Pacific War as much as bombs or bullets ever did. Historically, the involvement of women in these roles set a precedent for humane management of prisoners, showing that authority need not rely solely on force to achieve compliance. Their presence facilitated recovery, established order, and preserved life in a way that military hierarchy alone could not. The careful attention to nutrition, health, and documentation ensured that survival extended beyond the immediate cessation of hostilities. The tears of Japanese prisoners are, therefore, more than a moment of personal release. They are a symbol of transition. They represent the intersection of endurance and mercy, of indoctrination confronted with reality, and of humanity asserting itself after years of war. In this quiet, measured way, the war's end reshaped perceptions, not only of defeat, but of what it means to survive and bear witness to history. And as the camps emptied, as prisoners returned home, and as the world began to rebuild, that delicate balance between authority and compassion, between surrender and survival, remained a defining lesson. It is a reminder that even in the final moments of the most destructive conflicts, humanity can endure, and the smallest gestures of care can echo far beyond the battlefield.